Hello, and welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, our journey takes us away from the grand halls of palaces and the solemn quiet of ancient libraries. We are returning to a place we have visited before, but perhaps our last stay was too brief, too hurried. Tonight, we are going to settle in, to truly understand the smoky, sticky, and surprisingly complex world of the medieval tavern. I invite you now to find your most comfortable position. Let the sounds of your day, the concerns of your world, begin to fade. There is nothing you need to do, nothing to remember. There is only the story and the space I will weave for your mind to rest. We are going to forget everything we think we know from fantasy movies and video games. The clean, cheerful inn with a jolly proprietor and the heroic adventurers is a fiction. The reality was something far more grounded, far more human. The real medieval tavern was the beating heart of community life. It was the unofficial town hall, the stock exchange, the employment office, and the entertainment center, all rolled into one smoky, chaotic, and gloriously alive institution. But it was also a place where danger lurked, where the line between civilization and chaos was as thin as watered-down beer. So, dim the lights. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts soften, and let us ease into our journey together. Let us picture this together. Imagine you are not in the comfort of your bed, but somewhere else entirely. You are trudging through the muddy, unpaved streets of 14th century London. It is late in the day, and the sky is a uniform, oppressive gray. A cold, persistent rain has been falling for 3 days straight, turning every road into a shallow river of filth. Your boots, likely made of simple leather, make a squelching sound with every step as you navigate a thick mixture of horse dung, rotting vegetables, discarded refuse from the houses, and other things you would rather not identify. The air is cold and damp, and you pull your simple wool cloak tighter. It smells of wet wool and the ever-present coal smoke that hangs over the city. Your stomach growls, a hollow, gnawing sensation that speaks of a long day with little food. Your throat burns with a thirst that water alone cannot, and perhaps should not, quench. In this world, water is a gamble. In the distance, through the gray mist and smoke, you see it. It is not a bright, welcoming sign. It is a wooden shingle, creaking rhythmically on its hinges in the wind, painted with the crude, fading image of a boar's head. This is the ale stake, the signal to the weary and the thirsty. From the small, shuttered windows, a warm, flickering light spills out onto the muddy street. It is a beacon of orange in a world of gray. And with that light comes a wave of sound, a sudden burst of laughter, sharp and loud, followed by the dull, constant roar of shouting. You can just make out the sound of several people trying to sing a song, each in a different key, and each with great misplaced enthusiasm. You have found a tavern. You are cold, you are hungry, and you are tired. Your only goal is warmth, food, and drink. You reach the heavy wooden door, slick with rain, and push it open. As you cross the threshold, you are, whether you know it or not, entering a world that operates by its own set of rules. This is a micro-society, a stage where all of human life plays out. It is a place where fortunes are won and lost on a single roll of the dice, where a stray word or an accidental glance can earn you a knife between the ribs, and where the ale you are about to drink might, paradoxically, be the cleanest and safest thing you consume all day. Tonight, we are going to pull back that romantic veil that centuries of storytelling have draped over these establishments. We will explore the real, genuine article in all of its grimy, complex, and fascinating glory. We will discover what you would really eat, who you would meet, and how you might survive the experience. Because make no mistake, visiting a medieval tavern was an adventure in the truest sense of the word. And like all real adventures, it came with genuine, unavoidable risks. The first thing that hits you upon entering is not the sight, nor is it the sound. It is the smell. It is a physical presence, a complex, heavy bouquet of aromas that assaults your nostrils with the subtlety of a mailed fist. Let us try to untangle this dense atmosphere. First, there is the concentrated essence of unwashed humanity. In an age where a full bath was, at best, a seasonal activity and often a medicinal one, the natural odors of dozens of bodies packed into a small space are powerful. It is the smell of dried sweat from a long day's labor, the earthy dampness of mud-caked boots and leggings, and the heavy animal smell of wet wool cloaks steaming by the fire. Mixed with this is the sharp, sour, yeasty tang of spilled ale. This is not the smell of a single fresh spill. It is the accumulated scent of hundreds, perhaps thousands of gallons of ale, soaked deep into the floor, the tables, and the very walls themselves. It is a smell of fermentation, a living, breathing odor. Then, dominating everything is the smoke. It is the acrid, biting smoke of a poorly ventilated fire. The great hearth at one end of the room is the tavern's heart, its source of light and warmth, but it is an inefficient one. Smoke billows out into the room before it finds the crude smoke hole in the roof, blackening the ceiling and stinging the eyes. It is not just the clean smell of burning wood, but also the greasy, savory smoke of roasting meat and the perpetual pottage. And beneath it all, there are other, more mysterious odors. The faint, sweet smell of decomposition from the rushes on the floor, the pungent aroma of dried herbs and onions hanging from the rafters, and the unmistakable odor of things that had been left to ferment in dark corners for far too long. Your eyes water, and you find yourself coughing, a dry, rasping cough as your lungs try to adapt to an air so thick you could almost chew it. Then the sound. It is not a gentle hum. It is a wave of human noise. The roar of conversation, the sudden high-pitched shriek of laughter from a serving wench, a sharp, angry shout as a dice game goes wrong. You hear the heavy thud of wooden or pewter tankards slamming onto a table, the scrape of a bench on the hard earth floor, the crackle and hiss of the fire. In one corner, those voices you heard outside are still at it, their song a raucous, disjointed mess, but one they sing with total commitment. This is the sound of life, raw and unfiltered. For all its assault on the senses, there is something undeniably alive about this place. The very air seems to pulse with energy, with the raw vitality of people living at a basic, essential level. This is humanity stripped of pretense. It is uncomfortable, it is dirty, and it is dangerous. But as you stand there, your eyes slowly adjusting, you realize it is never, ever boring. Let us now take a closer look at the space itself, the physical container for all this life. As your eyes adjust to the dim, smoky light, you first look down at your feet. The floor, if you can call it that, is typically nothing more than packed earth. It is uneven, damp, and cold. To absorb the constant spills and provide some small, fleeting semblance of cleanliness, it is covered with a thick layer of rushes. These are long grasses cut from a nearby marsh and strewn across the floor. In theory, these rushes were meant to be changed regularly. In practice, they often remained in place for months, sometimes even seasons at a time. New rushes were simply thrown on top of the old, creating a thick, compressed mat. This mat slowly composted into a rich ecosystem of decomposing organic matter, spilled food, and the occasional small corpse of whatever vermin had been unlucky enough to meet its end in the tavern's depths. Walking across this floor is a treacherous experience. It is a spongy, unpredictable landscape. Your feet sink into soft spots where ale has soaked through to the earth below, or they crunch on the small, discarded bones of long-forgotten meals. If you are in a more upscale establishment, perhaps a tavern in a wealthy merchant district, there might be actual wooden floors. But even these offer little comfort. They are stained dark with years of spills and marked with the scars of countless knife fights, dice games gone wrong, and the general wear and tear of a populace that lived hard. You raise your eyes to the walls. They are not smooth plaster or clean wood. They are wattle and daub, wattle and daub. This is a construction method where wooden strips are woven together like a basket and then covered with a plaster made of mud, straw, and animal dung. These walls are blackened with smoke and grease. They are damp to the touch, sweating moisture in the winter and radiating a close, stifling heat in the summer. Crude paintings or carvings might decorate these walls, perhaps depicting a religious scene or the local lord's heraldry. Finally, you look up. The ceiling truly completes the atmospheric experience. It is low, oppressive, and blackened with decades of smoke. It seems to press down on the occupants like a physical weight. Massive wooden beams, dark as pitch, support the structure above. These beams are often salvaged from ships or torn from ancient forests. From these beams hang all manner of objects. You see bunches of dried herbs, rosemary, thyme, that do absolutely nothing to mask the prevailing odors. There are long braided strings of onions and garlic, and great sides of bacon or ham hanging in the smoky air to cure. The smoke, in this sense, is an active ingredient, preserving the food. This is the physical world of the tavern. A low, dark, smoky, and organic space, built of earth and wood, saturated with the smells and spills of the life it contains. Now that we have taken in the physical space, let us turn our attention to the people who populate this smoky underworld. As your eyes fully adjust to the dim light, the faces in the smoke begin to emerge. At a long, rough-hewn table near the fire, a group of merchants huddle together, their fine, if travel-stained, clothes setting them apart. They are counting coins with suspicious eyes, their voices a low, conspiratorial murmur. Not far from them, a group of soldiers, still wearing the caked-on mud and battered leather armor of a distant battlefield, laugh loudly as they drink. Their weapons are at their belts, a clear and present reminder of their profession. In a quieter, darker corner, you might see a pair of pilgrims, their cloaks marked with the sewn-on badges of their holy destination. They seek shelter and a hot meal on their long, arduous journey. Near the center of the room, a group of local craftsmen are celebrating the completion of a difficult commission. A blacksmith, a tanner, and a carpenter, their hands stained and calloused from their work, are raising their cups and singing. And then there are the locals, the men who seem to have grown from the very floorboards themselves. So perfectly do they blend with their surroundings. Each face tells a story, and most of those stories are written in scars, missing teeth, and eyes that had seen too much. These are not the clean, smiling peasants of romantic literature. These are real people, living real, hard lives in an age when survival was a daily struggle, and comfort was a luxury few could afford. They wear their hardships like badges of honor, and their laughter, when it comes, is not gentle. It has the sharp edge of those who knew that tomorrow might bring nothing but sorrow. And who presides over this glorious, terrible chaos? The tavern keeper. He is usually a man of substantial girth and questionable morals, standing behind a crude bar or moving through the crowd. He is the king over his court. Within these four walls, his word is law, and his justice is swift and often brutal. He has to be. He knows every customer's name, their debts, their secrets, and, most importantly, their weaknesses. He is part confessor, part loan shark, and part executioner, depending on what the situation required. His wife, if he has one, is often equally formidable. She might be seen emerging from the kitchen, wielding a wooden spoon or rolling pin with the skill of a trained warrior and the authority of a judge, ready to quell a dispute or extract payment from a reluctant customer. This is the world you have entered, a world where the normal rules of society are suspended, where anything can happen. It is a place that could offer you the best night of your life or the last night of your life, sometimes both at the same time. You have crossed more than just a threshold. You have entered a different realm entirely. It is important to understand, as a medieval traveler, that not all establishments offering drink were created equal. The subtle but crucial differences between an inn, a tavern, and an alehouse were distinctions that every traveler had to learn. Choosing the wrong one could mean the difference between a comfortable night's rest and waking up in a ditch with your purse missing and your head ringing like a church bell. Let us begin at the top of this hierarchy. Here we find the inns. The inns were the aristocrats of the hospitality world. Their primary function, the thing that set them apart, was that they were designed to house travelers. An inn offered not just food and drink, but also stables for horses and, crucially, actual beds, or at least something that resembled beds. The better inns were substantial, impressive buildings. They were often constructed of stone rather than the more common wood and daub. They might have multiple stories, courtyards, and numerous rooms. These establishments were built to accommodate merchants, pilgrims, and other travelers who had both the means and the need for overnight lodging. The most famous example, immortalized by Geoffrey Chaucer, is the Tabard Inn in Southwark, London. In the Canterbury Tales, this is the gathering place for the pilgrims before they set out on their journey. Chaucer's account gives us a glimpse of what a high-class inn aspired to be. The host of the Tabard, Harry Bailey, is described as a man of substance, someone who took pride in his establishment. He promises his guests victuals of the best kind, and wine that was both strong and pleasing. This was hospitality as a profession. The innkeeper was not just a brewer selling surplus. He was a businessman, often a member of a guild, and a respected, influential figure in the town. His job was to provide a full-service experience for travelers. But, and this is a crucial but, even the finest inns of the 14th century had peculiarities that would shock our modern sensibilities. The most jarring of all was the concept of privacy. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. When you paid your coin for a night's lodging at an inn, you were not paying for a private room. You were paying for a space, and more often than not, that space was shared. This was the fundamental, uncomfortable reality of travel. We shall explore this reality more deeply. Let us imagine you have chosen to stay at one of these finer inns. You have paid your coin, stabled your, perhaps imaginary horse, and you are shown to your room for the night. Privacy, as we have noted, was a concept reserved for the very highest echelons of society. A great lord or a bishop might command a room for himself. For everyone else, travelers were routinely packed into rooms like cargo. It was not uncommon for a single, large room to house 10 or 12 strangers. These were people you had never met, men and sometimes women from different regions speaking different dialects. And you would not just be sharing the same space. You would, almost certainly, be often the same bed. The great bed of a medieval inn was an enormous piece of furniture designed to hold 3, 4, or even more people. You paid for your spot in the bed. This practice was so common that rules of etiquette developed around it. Which way to face, how to arrange yourselves, how not to disturb your fellow sleepers. And what of the bed itself? It was a marvel of medieval engineering and endurance. It was constructed of a heavy wooden frame. Instead of a box spring, rope or leather straps were stretched across this frame to support the mattress. The mattress was a simple, heavy sack stuffed with straw, feathers, or whatever organic material was available and affordable. Now, we must consider the hygiene of this arrangement. These mattresses were rarely changed and never cleaned in any meaningful sense. They were home to entire ecosystems of fleas, lice, bed bugs, and other creatures that viewed human guests as nothing more than a convenient food source. The straw would break down, become damp, and harbor vermin. Sharing a bed with a group of complete strangers was, therefore, not just uncomfortable, but potentially dangerous. Theft was rampant. A traveler might wake to find the man sleeping soundly next to him had, in the night, quietly relieved him of his purse. Violence was also a constant risk, born of disputes over space, snoring, or the various bodily functions that humans perform during sleep. For this reason, many travelers learn to sleep with one eye open and their most valuable possessions clutched tightly to their chests, or perhaps hidden in a boot beneath their head. The food at these inns, while generally superior, was still a gamble. The best inns might offer roasted meats, fresh bread, and ale that had been brewed within the past few days. The worst might serve you something that had once been an animal, accompanied by bread that could double as a weapon, and ale that tasted suspiciously like it had been filtered through a horse. The inn, then, was the peak of comfort, but it was a peak that still required a strong stomach, a hardy constitution, and a very watchful eye. Moving down one step from the aristocratic inn, we find the establishment that is the focus of our journey, The tavern. Taverns occupied the middle ground of medieval hospitality. Their origin and their primary legal distinction was different from an inn. Originally, taverns were the domain of vintners, wine merchants, vintners. A tavern was, first and foremost, a place to buy and drink wine. Wine, as we have noted, was not the common drink of the people. That was ale. Wine was expensive, imported from France, Spain, or the Rhine region, and it carried with it an air of sophistication that ale could never match. It was the drink of the wealthy, the clergy, and the merchant class. The price reflected this status. A gallon of decent red wine from Gascony might cost 3 pennies. This was, as the source notes, twice the price of the finest ale. A more prized Rhenish wine could command 6 to 8 pennies per gallon. This was a staggering sum, perhaps a week's wages for a simple laborer. Because wine was so valuable, the trade was heavily regulated, and for a very good reason. Adulteration was common. An unscrupulous tavern keeper had many tricks. He might water down his wine to stretch his profits. He might mix an expensive Rhenish wine with a cheaper alternative, or, most egregiously, create entirely counterfeit versions using whatever ingredients they could find. Spices, herbs, and other colorings could be used to mask a poor quality product. The penalties for this deception were severe and public. A tavern keeper caught selling adulterated wine might find himself locked in the pillory with the offending liquid poured over his head. This was a form of punishment that combined public humiliation with poetic justice. To combat this fraud, customers had rights. A suspicious patron could demand to be taken down to the cellar to see the actual barrel from which his wine was being drawn. This practice led to the development of elaborate cellars beneath many taverns, cool, dark chambers where barrels aged and where authenticity could, in theory, be verified. In the streets, you might even hear the wine criers. These were officials whose job was to inspect and announce the quality and price of wine available. They would roam the streets, acting as both advertisement and consumer protection, proclaiming the arrival of a new, high-quality vintage at one tavern, or warning of establishments where the quality was suspect. Over time, these wine shops began to evolve. They began to expand their offerings beyond wine. They started selling cider, perry, and mead. Recognizing that hungry customers were thirsty customers, they began offering food as well. And finally, as their profits grew, many began offering rooms for rent, blurring the lines between taverns and inns. At the bottom of this hospitality hierarchy, at the base of the pyramid, we find the most common, most vital, and most humble establishment of all, the alehouse. Alehouses were everywhere. They began as private homes where the housewife brewed more ale than her family could consume. This woman, the proprietor, was known as an alewife. She was a brewer, a businesswoman, and a central figure in her neighborhood. The advertising for an alehouse was simple, but universally understood. The alewife would signal the availability of fresh ale by hanging a stick or broom outside their door. This was the ale stake, a simple but effective form of medieval advertising. A passerby would see the ale stake and know that a fresh, new batch was ready for drinking. We must remember, as we have discussed, that ale was the lifeblood of medieval society. It was consumed by everyone from infants to the elderly, primarily because it was often safer than water. The brewing process, which involved boiling water, killed many of the harmful bacteria that made a simple drink from a well or river a dangerous gamble. A typical alewife might brew several times a week. Medieval ale was a living product. It would last only a few days before turning sour or developing off flavors. This meant the supply was constant, but also inconsistent. Quality of ale varied enormously from house to house and batch to batch. Some alewives took pride in their craft, producing ale that was clear, flavorful, and properly fermented. Their reputation would grow, and their alehouse would become a popular spot. Others were less scrupulous. They might sell ale that was weak, sour, or contaminated. They might use whatever ingredients they had to stretch their grain supplies. Breadcrumbs, herbs, and even less savory additives might find their way into a batch of ale, either by accident or design. But alehouses offered more than just drink. They were social centers where news was shared, gossip was exchanged, and business was conducted. A successful alewife would find herself at the center of her community social network, privy to secrets and scandals that could make or break reputations. She was part bartender, part therapist, and part intelligence broker. Atmosphere in an alehouse was typically more relaxed than in a tavern. These were neighborhood establishments where everyone knew everyone else. Credit might be extended to trusted customers. But, as the source notes, even alehouses had their dangers, and a stranger entering such an establishment might find himself the subject of intense scrutiny and suspicion. He was, after all, an outsider in someone else's living room. Let us stay with the alewife for a moment, for she is one of the most fascinating figures in this world. She was one of the few avenues for a woman to be an independent business owner in the medieval period. But this independence came with great risk and constant scrutiny. Despite the humble, domestic origins of their business, alehouses were subject to strict regulation. The most significant of these was the Assize of Bread and Ale, a law enacted in England in 1266. This law was a form of price control. It tied the price of ale to the price of wheat and established quality standards that all brewers were expected to meet. The idea was to prevent brewers from price gouging on an essential staple of life. To enforce this law, towns appointed officials known as aconners, ale tasters. These were sworn officials whose job it was to test ale and ensure its quality. They would make regular rounds of alehouses, sampling the wares and ensuring that customers were getting what they paid for. The punishments for brewing bad ale or charging excessive prices were, like all medieval punishments, severe in public. A male brewer who violated the assize might find themselves locked in the pillory. Here, he would be subject to public ridicule and assault from his neighbors, who might throw rotten vegetables or offal at him. Female brewers, the alewives, faced a different and perhaps more terrifying punishment, the trebuchet. The source clarifies that this was not the massive siege engine, but a smaller device designed to dunk the offender repeatedly in the nearest body of water. This was the cucking stool. The alewife would be strapped to a chair at the end of a long pole and then plunged repeatedly into what was often the dirtiest, most refuse-filled pond or river in the town. These punishments served both as deterrent and entertainment, drawing crowds who enjoyed watching the downfall of those who had tried to cheat their neighbors. This legal danger was compounded by social vulnerability. As the source later notes, alewives, as independent businesswomen, were vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or other crimes that could destroy their reputations and their livelihoods. A woman who was too successful, too outspoken, or simply unpopular could easily become a target. In popular songs and poems of the day, the alewife was often portrayed as a dishonest, greedy, and morally suspect character. This was the cultural price she paid for her independence. She had to be a skilled artisan, a shrewd businesswoman, a discreet confidant, and a strong-willed manager, all while navigating a legal and social system that was deeply suspicious of her very existence. We have established that ale was the lifeblood of society, but to truly understand the tavern, we must delve deeper into why. The medieval relationship with alcohol was fundamentally different from our modern understanding. It was a relationship born not of vice, but of necessity. In the medieval world, sobriety was not just unpleasant, but potentially fatal. The reason was simple: water. Water, the most basic of human needs, was often the most dangerous thing you could put in your mouth. Let us examine the water sources. The rivers served as highways, sewers, and dumping grounds all at once. The source gives the specific example of the Thames in London. It was, in grim reality, a flowing cocktail of human waste, animal carcasses, industrial runoff from tanneries and dye works, and the general detritus of urban life. Tanneries would dump toxic chemicals and animal scraps. Butcher shops would discard offal, and human waste from latrines built over the river would flow directly into the water source. What about wells? Wells, when they existed, were frequently contaminated by seepage from nearby cesspits or graveyards. Urban planning did not account for groundwater contamination. A family's well could be mere yards away from the pit where they and their neighbors disposed of their waste. Even rainwater collected in barrels and cisterns quickly became breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites, as they were open to insects and animal droppings. The solution to this pervasive, invisible threat was alcohol. The brewing and fermentation process, which required boiling water to create the wort, or base of the ale, killed most of the harmful microorganisms that made water dangerous. The ethanol produced during fermentation also acted as a mild preservative. This wasn't understood in scientific terms, the source reminds us. The germ theory of disease was still centuries away. But the practical effects were obvious. People who drank ale and wine were less likely to fall ill with the mysterious stomach ailments that plagued those who relied on water. This reality created a society where alcohol consumption began at birth and continued until death. Infants were given weak ale or wine mixed with water. Children drank small beer, which was a low-alcohol beverage that provided calories and hydration without causing intoxication. And adults consumed stronger versions throughout the day, not to get drunk, but to stay alive and healthy. Ale was not just a drink. It was hydration, it was calories, it was medicine, and it was safety. The tavern, therefore, was not just a bar. It was a life-sustaining resource, as vital as a bakery or a well, only safer. Given its vital importance, let us spend a moment on the craft of brewing itself. As we've noted, it was primarily women's work, a domestic skill passed down from mother to daughter like cooking or weaving. The process was both art and science, relying on intuition and inherited wisdom rather than precise measurement. The basic ingredients were simple. First was malted barley. The barley was soaked until it began to sprout, then dried to halt the germination process. This malting converted the grain starches into fermentable sugars. This was the food for the yeast. This malted barley was then mashed with hot water to extract these sugars, creating a sweet liquid called wort. Wort. The third ingredient, yeast, was a mystery. The source says wild yeasts in the air would begin fermentation naturally. Brewers had no concept of yeast as a microorganism. They simply knew that if they left the wort out in a certain way, in certain lucky vats, it would begin to bubble and transform. But simplicity in ingredients didn't mean simplicity in execution. The quality of the barley affected everything. The water source was crucial, and medieval brewers had no thermometers to guide them, relying instead on experience and intuition to judge the temperature of the mash. But perhaps the biggest difference from modern beer was the flavoring. Hops, which would later become essential to beer brewing, were not widely used in medieval England until the 15th century. Hops provide bitterness to balance the sweetness of the malt and, crucially, have powerful preservative qualities. Before hops, brewers relied on a mixture of herbs and spices called gruit. Gruit. This gruit was a proprietary blend that varied from region to region. It might include notes of herbs, spices, and other plants. The source specifies bog myrtle, yarrow, heather, and dozens of other plants. This gruit did more than just flavor the ale. Some of these additives had psychoactive properties, adding an extra dimension to the drinking experience that modern beer lacks. An evening's drink might not just be intoxicating, but mildly hallucinogenic or stimulating, depending on the brewer's recipe. Bore little resemblance to modern beer. It was cloudy, often thick enough to chew, as it was full of grain proteins and yeast, and had a complex, often sweet, herbal, and spicy flavor. It was consumed within a few days of brewing, as it had no preservatives. The alcohol content varied wildly from the weak small beer given to children to stronger versions that could leave a grown man senseless. This small beer was likely made from the second wash of the grains, resulting in a drink that was hydrating and caloric but not intoxicating. While ale was the drink of the masses, the tavern and inn offered other, more specialized beverages. We have touched on wine, but let us look closer at its place in the medieval world. Wine occupied a different niche. Where ale was common, wine carried connotations of sophistication, wealth, and religious significance. Its use in the Christian communion gave it a sacred quality that ale could never match. Its high cost made it a status symbol. England, for the most part, did not produce its own wine. It came primarily from its continental possessions and trading partners. Gascon wine from southwestern France was the most common, a staple red wine that was relatively affordable and traveled well. Rhenish wine from the German regions along the Rhine was more expensive but prized for its quality. Spanish and Portuguese wines were exotic luxuries. This wine trade was international commerce at its most complex. Merchants had to navigate not just the physical challenges of transportation. where wine could spoil, freeze, or turn to vinegar, but also the political and economic obstacles created by wars, tariffs, and trade disputes. Vintners Company in London was one of the most powerful guilds, a testament to the wealth and influence of these wine merchants. But wine's prestige, as we noted, made it a target for fraud. Alum, honey, herbs, and even more dangerous substances might be added to mimic the color, flavor, or effects of genuine wine. Then there was mead. Mead, made from fermented honey, occupied a special place in medieval drinking culture. It was often called the drink of the gods, associated with celebration, ceremony, and the warrior culture of earlier ages. It was expensive to produce. Why? Because honey was a valuable commodity used for sweetening, medicine, and candle making. To ferment it into a drink was a true luxury. Spices, fruits, and herbs might be added to create different flavors. And some meads were aged for years, developing complex flavors that could rival the finest wines. Finally, there were the regional, seasonal drinks, cider and perry, made from apples and pears respectively. In areas like Kent or the West Country, where apple orchards flourished, cider might be more common than ale. These drinks were seasonal, available only at certain times of year. The apples used were not sweet-eating apples, but specific varieties, bred for their fermentation qualities. These cider apples were often small, sour, and unpalatable when fresh, but they produced beverages of remarkable complexity and strength. All these drinks, ale, wine, mead, cider, were living products, unpredictable, and essential to life. If the drink in medieval taverns was questionable, the food was often downright dangerous. Yet, we must approach this with the medieval mindset. For many people, the tavern meal was the best they could hope for. It was a hot, filling dish that might contain actual meat and vegetables, served in portions generous enough to satisfy. For a laborer living in a cold room with no kitchen, the tavern was his only source of hot food. The absolute, undeniable centerpiece of tavern cuisine was pottage. Pottage was a thick stew that could contain virtually anything edible and quite a few things that weren't. The concept was simple and economical. Take a large cauldron, fill it with water or broth, add whatever ingredients were available, and let it simmer over the hearth until everything was tender enough to eat. The result was a dish that was different every day, sometimes different every hour, as new ingredients were added to replace what had been served. The ultimate expression of this philosophy was the perpetual stew or hunter's pot, a cauldron kept simmering constantly, perhaps for days or even weeks. New ingredients added as old ones were consumed. The scraps from yesterday's meal, the vegetable peelings, a handful of barley, a piece of old bread, perhaps a rabbit or pigeon. It all went into the pot. In theory, this created a continuously evolving dish that never ran out. In practice, it created a breeding ground for bacteria and a repository for ingredients of questionable origin and dubious freshness. The long, slow simmer would kill most active bacteria, but toxins and off-flavors were a constant issue. What was in it? The base of most pottages, was grain, barley, oats, wheat, or whatever was cheapest. This provided bulk and calories. Vegetables were added when available: onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, carrots, whatever could be foraged from the countryside. The cooking process itself was fraught with hazards. The great cauldrons were difficult to clean thoroughly, and residue from previous batches could contaminate new ones. Stirring was done with long wooden spoons that might not be cleaned between uses. Despite all this, tavern food served an important social and nutritional function. It was also a social experience, bringing people together around shared tables. As the source so aptly puts it, a bowl of well-made pottage, served hot and accompanied by fresh bread and good ale, could transform a cold, wet, miserable day into something bearable. It was, truly, sustenance for both body and soul. Beyond the ever-present pottage, what else might you find on the tavern menu? Let us speak of the meat. Meat, when it appeared in pottage, was often of uncertain origin and questionable quality. The most common would be beef, pork, mutton, and chicken, but rabbit, deer, and other game might find their way into the pot. The quality was, to be charitable, poor. It was typically tough, stringy, and well past its prime. These were the kind of cuts that required long, slow cooking to become even marginally edible. But it wasn't just the quality of the meat that was concerning, it was the source. A frugal tavern keeper was not above using meat that had been rejected by other buyers, animals that had died of disease, or cuts that had been sitting in the market for days without finding a purchaser. The long cooking process would kill most harmful bacteria, but it couldn't eliminate the off flavors and textures that came with spoiled meat. Fish was another common ingredient, especially during Lent and other holy days when the church forbade meat. Medieval preservation techniques were primitive. Any fish that had traveled any distance from the sea was likely to be heavily salted, dried, or pickled. Fresh fish was a luxury that few taverns could afford. Bread was the other staple of tavern meals, but its quality varied enormously. The best taverns might serve white bread made from wheat flour, a luxury that was soft, flavorful, and relatively fresh. More commonly, customers received brown bread made from barley, rye, or mixed grains, which was often several days old and hard enough to use as a weapon. The worst bread was made from whatever grain was cheapest, often mixed with sawdust, ground acorns, or other fillers to stretch the flour. This bread was dense, gritty, and barely edible, but it provided calories. This hard, stale bread was often used as a trencher. This was an edible plate on which other foods were served. The pottage would be ladled onto the thick slice, and by the end of the meal, it had absorbed enough juices and flavors to become palatable, and would then be eaten or given to the poor. Other items were simple. Cheese was another common offering, ranging from fresh, soft varieties to aged, hard cheeses that could last for months. Eggs, when available, were a welcome addition, but without refrigeration, it was difficult to tell fresh eggs from spoiled ones until they were cracked open. Hygiene in preparation was non-existent. Cross-contamination was inevitable. Raw meat might be prepared on the same surface as bread, and the serving of food was as haphazard as its preparation. Dishes were often shared, with everyone eating from the same bowl or platter. Customers ate with their hands, shared knives, and drank from communal cups, spreading diseases and parasites with every meal. Let us return to the patrons. As you sit, nursing your cup of ale, you are surrounded by a cast of characters that would make a modern crime novelist weep with envy. These are real people living on the margins of society, each with their own agenda. The merchants were perhaps the most visible and vocal. These were almost exclusively men who traveled the dangerous roads between towns and cities, carrying goods, news, and often substantial amounts of coin. They were natural storytellers, regaling anyone who would listen with tales of distant markets, exotic goods, and the perils of the road. A successful merchant in a medieval tavern was like a walking advertisement for prosperity, dressed in fine clothes, sporting jewelry. But this display of wealth made him a target for every cutpurse, confidence man, and outright robber in the establishment. Smart merchants traveled in groups, hired guards, and kept their most valuable possessions hidden. Yet, the less successful merchants were often more dangerous than their prosperous counterparts. These were desperate men with failing businesses, mounting debts, and families to feed. They were capable of almost anything. A merchant on the edge of bankruptcy was a man with nothing left to lose, unpredictable and potentially violent. Soldiers were another common sight, and their presence could either ensure peace or guarantee trouble depending on their mood, their sobriety, and their recent experiences. Veterans of foreign wars brought with them not just scars and stories, but also a casual attitude toward violence that could turn a simple disagreement into a bloodbath. They were skilled with weapons and often suffering from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The best soldiers were disciplined professionals. They might be hired as guards, escorts, or enforcers, and their presence in a tavern could actually make it safer. The worst soldiers were little better than bandits with military training. These were deserters, discharged veterans with no other skills, and mercenaries between contracts. They often turned to crime to survive. They knew how to fight, how to kill, and how to intimidate, making them formidable opponents. As the source aptly concludes, a tavern full of unemployed soldiers was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Continuing our quiet observation of the tavern's clientele, we turn our attention to the pilgrims. These figures represented a different kind of danger. It was not physical violence, but moral corruption. These supposedly holy travelers were often the most worldly people in the tavern, having seen more of life than the local residents could imagine. While some were genuine seekers of spiritual enlightenment, many others were using pilgrimage as an excuse for adventure, escape from legal troubles, or simply an extended vacation from the responsibilities of home. The Canterbury Tales gives us a vivid picture of medieval pilgrims, and it's not always flattering. Chaucer's colorful cast, journeying to a holy site, include a corrupt pardoner, selling fake relics, a summoner who takes bribes to overlook sins, and the famous wife of Bath who has buried 5 husbands and is looking for number 6. These were people who understood how to manipulate religious sentiment for personal gain, and in many ways they were often more dangerous than the obvious criminals, because they hid their true nature behind a facade of piety. Craftsmen and artisans formed another significant group in the tavern population. These were the skilled workers, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, potters. They were the backbone of medieval economy. Socially, they occupied a middle ground, being more prosperous than common laborers, but less wealthy than successful merchants. This made them both envied and resented. Their guild membership gave craftsmen a certain status and protection, but it also created rivalries and conflicts that could spill over into violence. Different guilds competed for customers, disputed territorial boundaries, and fought over the right to practice certain trades. The tavern might become neutral ground where these disputes could be settled, or, just as likely, it might become a battlefield where old grudges were settled with fists and knives. The most dangerous craftsmen were those who had been expelled from their guilds. These men had skills but no legitimate way to use them, making them natural recruits for criminal enterprises. A blacksmith who could forge weapons and pick locks, a carpenter who could build secret compartments and hidden passages. All were valuable assets to the criminal underworld. Our survey of the tavern's patrons would not be complete without three final, crucial groups. First, the clergy, who were surprisingly common in medieval taverns despite official church disapproval. Parish priests, traveling monks, and minor church officials all found themselves in taverns either by necessity or by choice. Some were genuinely pious men who had no other option for food and shelter during their travels, but others were using their religious status as a cover for less holy activities. The corrupt clergyman was a stock character in medieval literature, but he was also a real presence. These men had education, connections, and moral authority that they could use for personal gain. They might sell false indulgences, perform illegal marriages, or provide sanctuary to criminals in exchange for payment. Next, the most obvious, yet most hidden criminals, thieves and cutpurses. They were often the most skilled at blending in with legitimate customers. The best thieves were indistinguishable from honest merchants, craftsmen, or travelers until the moment they struck. They were professionals. They studied their victims carefully, learning their habits, their weaknesses, and the location of their valuables. They often worked in teams, with one member creating a distraction while another picked pockets or cut purse strings. But not all thieves were professionals. Desperate people driven to crime by poverty, debt, or other circumstances were often clumsy and dangerous. They might resort to violence when stealth failed, turning a simple theft into assault or murder. These amateurs were unpredictable and often more dangerous. Finally, we must consider the women in medieval taverns who occupied a complex and often dangerous position. We have met the alewives, businesswomen in their own right, but vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. Serving wenches faced constant harassment and the threat of sexual violence, while prostitutes operated in a legal gray area. But medieval women were not passive victims. Many were skilled in the use of knives, poisons, and other weapons, and they were often more ruthless than their male counterparts when threatened. The tavern keeper's wife, as we've noted, might be the real power behind the establishment, using her knowledge of customers' secrets and weaknesses to maintain order and extract payment. Female criminals often use their supposed weakness and innocence as weapons, luring victims into traps. Rogues' Gallery created an atmosphere of constant tension and unpredictability. Trust was a luxury that few could afford, and betrayal was always just a drink away. As the night deepens and the ale flows, the energy in the tavern shifts. In the flickering candlelight, fortunes were won and lost with the roll of dice. Gambling wasn't just entertainment. It was a way of life, a means of social advancement, and often a path to ruin. Dice were the most popular gambling implements, and for good reason. They were small, portable, and could be made from readily available materials like bone, wood, or stone. The games were simple enough that even the most illiterate peasant could understand, yet complex enough to sustain interest through long nights of play. But medieval dice games were far from the standardized casino games of today. They were wild, unpredictable affairs where the rules changed with the players. And, most importantly, cheating was considered more of an art form than a crime. The most common dice game was hazard, which the source notes a precursor to modern craps. The player would call a number between 5 and 9 as his main, then attempt to roll that number before rolling other combinations that would make him lose. It sounds simple, but the betting possibilities were endless, with side wagers on individual throws creating a complex web of financial obligations that could bankrupt a man in minutes. There were other games as well. There was raffle, where players tried to throw 3 dice and get all the same number. There was mum chance, a game so dependent on luck that it became synonymous with random fortune. And passage, where players bet on whether they could throw doubles. The dice themselves were often works of art, carved from the bones of exotic animals or ivory. Wealthy players might own sets of dice, while poor players may do with crude wooden cubes that were barely symmetrical. But regardless of their construction, all dice were suspect. Loaded dice, shaved dice, and dice with duplicate numbers were common. Players developed elaborate rituals for inspecting dice before play began. The most skilled dice players were those who could cheat without being detected. They might use sleight of hand to substitute loaded dice for fair ones, employ confederates to distract other players at crucial moments, or use subtle signals to coordinate their betting. The best cheaters were so skilled that they could manipulate the outcome of games while appearing to be the victims of bad luck themselves. This made the game not just one of chance, but one of perception, deception, and nerve. But dice weren't the only gambling games in medieval taverns. Cards, though less common than dice, were growing in popularity throughout the later medieval period. The earliest playing cards were hand-painted works of art that were far too expensive for common use. But by the 14th century, printed cards were becoming more affordable and widespread. Medieval card games bore little resemblance to modern poker or blackjack. They were often based on matching suits or sequences with complex scoring systems. Primero, an ancestor of poker, involved betting on the strength of one's hand. The most dangerous aspect of medieval card games wasn't the games themselves, but the accusations of cheating that inevitably arose. Marked cards, dealing from the bottom of the deck, and collusion between players were common. But proving cheating was difficult and often led to violence. A player accused of cheating might find himself facing not just the loss of his winnings, but a knife in the ribs. Beyond dice and cards, taverns hosted a bewildering variety of gambling activities. Arm wrestling contests, drinking competitions, and tests of skill or knowledge all became opportunities for wagering. Customers might bet on which of 2 flies would reach the ceiling first, whether the next person through the door would be male or female, or how many beans were in a jar. Anything that had an uncertain outcome could become the subject of a wager. Blood sports were also popular. Fighting was particularly popular, cockfighting in taverns that had outdoor space. Two roosters would be placed in a pit while spectators bet on the outcome. The fights were brutal and often ended in the death of one or both birds. Bear baiting and bull baiting were less common, but even more spectacular. A bear or bull would be chained to a post and attacked by specially trained dogs while spectators wagered. The social dynamics of gambling were complex and often dangerous. Winning too much too quickly could mark a player as a cheat or a target for robbery. Losing too much could lead to desperate attempts to recoup losses that often ended in violence or crime. And it wasn't just about money. Social status, reputation, and honor were also at stake. A nobleman who lost consistently to a peasant might find his social standing damaged, while a merchant who was caught cheating might find his business reputation ruined. For most people, life was a constant struggle. Gambling offered the possibility, however remote, of escaping these constraints. It was a form of hope, however irrational, that tomorrow might be better than today. In the shadowy corners and upstairs rooms of medieval taverns, another ancient profession plied its trade with a mixture of desperation, cunning, and resigned acceptance. Prostitution wasn't just tolerated in medieval taverns, it was often an integral part of the business model, additional income for tavern keepers, and additional services for customers who had coin to spend. The women who worked as prostitutes in medieval taverns came from all walks of life, though poverty was the common thread that bound their stories together. Some were widows who had lost their husbands to war, disease, or accident. No other means of supporting themselves and their children. Others were young women who had been seduced and abandoned, their reputations ruined, and their prospects for marriage destroyed. Still others were simply products of a society that offered few legitimate opportunities for women to earn a living wage. The church officially condemned prostitution as a mortal sin, but even religious authorities recognized its practical necessity. St. Augustine had argued that prostitution was like sewers in a palace, unpleasant but necessary to prevent worse corruption. This pragmatic approach led to a complex system of regulation and tolerance. In some cities, prostitution was completely legal and regulated. Licensed brothel operated openly, with workers subject to regular health inspections and paying taxes. But in taverns, the situation was more ambiguous. It might be tolerated as long as it was discreet, or officially prohibited while being unofficially encouraged. Tavern keepers walked a fine line between maximizing their profits and avoiding legal troubles. The working conditions were harsh and dangerous. They had little protection from violent or abusive customers, no recourse when clients refused to pay, and constant exposure to sexually transmitted diseases that could be disfiguring or fatal. Pregnancy was an occupational hazard, and the primitive methods of birth control and abortion were often more dangerous than childbirth itself. The economic arrangements varied widely. Some women worked as independent contractors, renting rooms from the tavern keeper. Others were essentially employees, or, in the worst situations, essentially slaves, trapped by debt, violence, or legal constraints. The customers who sought the services were as diverse as the women who served them. Merchants traveling far from home, soldiers on leave, craftsmen celebrating. But prostitution in medieval taverns wasn't just about sex. It was about companionship, entertainment, and emotional connection. Many customers were lonely men far from home who valued conversation and affection as much as physical gratification. Successful prostitutes learned to be actresses, therapists, and confidants, adapting their personalities to meet the emotional needs of their clients. Violence in medieval taverns wasn't an aberration. It was an integral part of the social fabric, as expected and inevitable as the sunrise. This is a difficult concept for the modern mind to grasp, as we are accustomed to violence being a failure of the system. In the medieval tavern, it was the system. The tavern served as both pressure valve and proving ground for the aggressive impulses that simmered beneath the surface of medieval society. The causes of tavern violence were as varied as the people who frequented these establishments. A perceived slight, a disputed debt, a woman's honor, a political disagreement, or simply too much ale. But understanding the triggers, the source states, was less important than understanding the culture that made violence not just acceptable, but often necessary for survival and social standing. The key to this culture is one word: honor. Honor was the currency of medieval society, and it was a currency that could be devalued by a single moment of perceived cowardice or disrespect. A man who allowed himself to be insulted without response might find his reputation permanently damaged, affecting not just his social standing, but his ability to conduct business, attract a wife, or command respect from his peers. In a world with no effective police force and a slow, corrupt legal system, a man's reputation for being able to defend himself was his security. In this context, violence wasn't just an option. It was often the only option for maintaining one's place in society. This violence also served important social functions. It was a way of establishing and maintaining social hierarchies, with stronger or more skilled fighters earning respect. It was a form of entertainment for spectators who might bet on the outcome of fights. And, most critically, it was a method of dispute resolution in a society where formal legal mechanisms were often unavailable or ineffective. A fight, in this sense, was a trial. The rituals surrounding tavern violence were as important as the violence itself. Challenges might be issued according to specific formulas with particular words or gestures that carried precise meanings. The choice of weapons, the location of the fight, all had significance. These rituals helped to legitimize violence and distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable forms of aggression. It was, in its own brutal way, a system of rules. Let us imagine, then, that a dispute has broken out. The rituals of honor have failed, and violence is now inevitable. What did this look like? The weapons available in medieval taverns were limited by law and custom, but creativity and desperation could turn almost anything into an instrument of death. Knives were the most common weapons, primarily because they were carried by virtually everyone for eating and general utility. These weren't the small table knives of modern times, but substantial blades capable of inflicting serious wounds. A skilled knife fighter could kill an opponent in seconds. Swords were less common in taverns, partly because they were expensive and partly because they were often restricted by law to the nobility. But when swords did appear in tavern fights, the results were usually spectacular and bloody. The confined space made sword fighting particularly dangerous for bystanders. More commonly, tavern fighters made do with improvised weapons. Wooden stools became clubs, Pottery shards became cutting implements, and even eating utensils could be pressed into service. The heavy pewter, or wooden tankards used for drinking ale were particularly effective as bludgeons, capable of crushing skulls or breaking bones with a single well-placed blow. The fighting styles employed were brutal and practical, focused on ending conflicts quickly. This was not the chivalric duel of knights. Grappling, gouging, biting, and kicking were all acceptable tactics, and fighters often aimed for vulnerable areas like the eyes, throat, and groin. Group fights were particularly chaotic and dangerous. A dispute between two individuals could quickly escalate into a general melee. Alliances formed and dissolved in seconds as customers chose sides based on personal relationships, ethnic loyalties, or simple proximity. The aftermath of tavern violence was often as dangerous as the violence itself. Wounded fighters might die from their injuries days or weeks later, not from the initial blow, but from the infection that followed. This turned what had seemed like a minor altercation into a case of murder. Families and friends of the injured or killed might seek revenge, creating cycles of violence that could persist for generations. And the economic consequences were also significant. Property damage had to be repaired. Injured customers might be unable to work, and dead customers obviously couldn't pay their bills, leaving tavern keepers to absorb the losses. With all this crime, gambling, and violence, how was order maintained? What did justice even mean in this context? Justice in medieval taverns was a complex and often contradictory affair, where official law enforcement competed with unofficial systems of order. The tavern existed in a legal gray area, simultaneously subject to royal authority, church jurisdiction, guild regulations, and local customs, all of which might contradict each other. The most visible representatives of official law enforcement were the constables, bailiffs, and other officers. But these men were often part-time officials who combined law enforcement duties with other occupations, and their effectiveness varied widely based on their personal courage, political connections, and financial resources. A constable who tried to arrest a popular local figure might find himself facing a hostile crowd, while one who targeted unpopular outsiders might receive enthusiastic support. Crimes that law enforcement officials were most concerned with were those that threatened public order or royal authority. Treason, sedition, and violent crimes that resulted in serious injury or death. But many activities that would be considered criminal today were either legal or tolerated. Gambling was officially prohibited, but widely practiced and rarely prosecuted. Prostitution might be regulated rather than banned. Even violence might be overlooked if it was seen as a legitimate response to provocation. The church had its own system of law enforcement. Canon law governed many aspects of medieval life, including marriage, sexual behavior, and religious observance. Taverns were particular targets of church enforcement for the sins of drinking, gambling, prostitution, and violence. The guild system provided another layer of law enforcement. Guilds had the authority to regulate their members' business practices, set prices, and quality standards. The most effective form of law enforcement in medieval taverns was often the informal system of social control exercised by the tavern keeper and regular customers. A strong tavern keeper could maintain order through a combination of personal authority, physical intimidation, and economic incentives. He might police each other's customers' behavior to protect their favorite establishment from official interference. In this informal system, the tavern keeper serving as judge, jury, and executioner. Punishments might range from public humiliation and temporary banishment to physical violence and even death. Corruption was endemic. Officials might accept bribes to overlook illegal activities. Tavern keepers might pay protection money to avoid harassment. It was a tangled, messy, and deeply human system of justice, based more on power and personality than on written law. As dawn broke over the medieval world, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold, the taverns that had pulsed with life throughout the night began their slow transformation. Evidence of the previous evening's activities lingered like smoke in the rafters. Bloodstains on the floor, broken furniture in the corners, and the hollow-eyed stares of those who had gambled away their futures. The morning after was when the true cost of tavern life became apparent. Bodies had to be removed, some merely unconscious from drink, others permanently silenced by violence. Debts had to be collected or forgiven, depending on the debtor's ability to pay and the creditor's capacity for mercy. For the tavern keeper, morning brought the grim arithmetic of profit and loss. How much had been earned from food, drink, and other services? How much had been lost to theft, damage, and unpaid bills? The cleanup process was both physical and social. Floors had to be swept, furniture repaired. But more importantly, relationships had to be mended, alliances renegotiated. A fight between two regular customers might require weeks of careful diplomacy to resolve. The customers who had survived the night faced their own reckonings. Merchants had to assess whether their business dealings had been profitable or disastrous. Craftsmen had to return to their workshops and try to focus on their trades despite hangovers, injuries. In the harsh light of day, actions that had seemed reasonable in the flickering candlelight might appear sordid or shameful. The filthy truth about medieval taverns, the source concludes, was that they were simultaneously the best and worst of their world. They were places of genuine community and brutal exploitation, of authentic human connection and calculated manipulation, of liberation from social constraints and enslavement to human weakness. The medieval tavern was a mirror that reflected both the best and worst aspects of human society. It was a place where the veneer of civilization was stripped away to reveal the raw humanity beneath. In the end, the medieval tavern stands as a testament to the resilience and adaptability of human society. Despite all the dangers, contradictions, and moral compromises, these institutions survived and thrived because they met real human needs in ways that no other social institution could match. They provided spaces where people could be fully human with all the messiness, complexity, and contradiction that entails. The medieval tavern may be gone, but its spirit lives on, wherever people gather to share food, drink, stories, and the fundamental human experience. They were profoundly human institutions that reflected the full complexity of the human condition. They were places where people came to be themselves, for better or worse. And now, as our journey comes to a close, you can let these images of the past fade. Leave the smoke, the noise, and the cold, damp floors behind. Feel yourself returning to the present moment, to the quiet, the safety, and the comfort of your own space. You are safe, and there is nothing left to do but to let your mind drift and to sleep. Good night.